to the layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 68. A way to remember this psalm is with the phrase, spoils to the victor. In this psalm, a triumphal procession parading the spoils of war represents a victory and a victor worth celebrating. The psalm is divided into 5 main sections. In the first, departure, God comes out of the wilderness, preparing to fight a battle on behalf of his people. In the second section, battle, the kings of armies flee, and their gods are shown to be inferior. Between the second and fourth sections is verse 19, the centerpiece of the psalm. This verse summarizes the entire victory. The victor, accompanied by his spoils of war, ascends to the throne in triumph. The fourth section is the processional, describing the scene as the ark of the Lord is accompanied up to Jerusalem to celebrate victory. The final section is celebration, where, upon hearing the Lord's thunderous voice, Israel and the kingdoms of the earth praise God for his victory. Note the 2 purple ovals with, "May the Lord be blessed," and "May God be blessed." These mark this half of the poem as a cohesive unit describing the celebration. The first half of the poem provides images of the departure and battle, but the second half is all celebration, starting with the processional, which is the Israelite celebration, followed by a call for the kings of the earth to also join in the celebration. The emotional tone of the psalm is very important for understanding it correctly. The first section, which introduces the victor, radiates confidence and joy, expressing the belief that God will always depart from his dwelling place on behalf of his people, just as he has done in the past. The second section recounts a prophecy about a victory over mighty kings in battle, but delivered in terms of endearment toward Israel, followed by a contemptuous mocking of those kings' gods. Both the centerpiece of the psalm and the following processional depict the various stages of a victory procession. The emotional tone can therefore only be described as triumphant. The final section concludes with all people in awe of God's great power and his generosity towards the people, leading to an exultant celebration. We'll now walk through the poem, explaining it verse by verse. Superscription, which is verse 1. For the director, by David, a psalm, a song. We interpret the psalms with the superscription, for the director, as musical compositions intended for temple musicians to perform in public settings. This was a planned song, written by David, intended for public performance. This psalm is also labeled as both a psalm and a song. This suggests it fits into multiple categories. It's about a triumphal procession, but it's also written to praise the God of Israel who delivered them in the past. It's a song that reminds Israel who her God is and what she can depend on from him. Departure. The first section introduces the departure. God, who is known by his characteristic actions on behalf of his people, goes out from the wilderness. His character becomes evident through how others respond to him, including both his enemies and his own people. Verse 2. God arises, his enemies scatter, and those who hate him flee from his presence. In order to understand this verse, we need to first recall Numbers 10:35. And whenever the ark set out, Moses said, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." This psalm is deeply connected to historical battles and victories. The ark was always a part of those battles, and even here, the setting for this psalm is a triumphal procession where the ark, representing the Lord, was taken up to Jerusalem to celebrate a great victory. That procession is introduced with the same formula Moses used, calling upon the Lord to make himself known before Israel's enemies. The evidence of the Lord's presence would cause them to scatter and flee. In this psalm, the request for God to act is presented as a characteristic action. God consistently arises to fight on behalf of his people. When he does, his enemies will consistently scatter, and those who hate him will flee. This follows a predictable pattern because of who God is. Verse 3, as smoke is driven away, so you drive them away. As wax melts before a fire, so the wicked perish before God. The fate of enemies is a key focus of this verse. It is not enough to say that they scatter and flee. A more vivid image compares the enemies to smoke or wax, some of the most transient substances, whose shape cannot be restored once lost. Upon hearing this analogy, ancient Israelite audiences would have recalled another portion of the scriptures. In Psalm 1, verse 4, the wicked were likened to chaff that the wind drove away. Therefore, when these enemies are driven away, it is not a temporary setback with the possibility to recover. When God's enemies perish, they perish decisively, with no hope of returning to their former position. Verse 4, but the righteous exult joyfully before God, and they shout with a joyful sound. The response of the enemies was given. Here, the righteous respond as well, but with the greatest joy, exultant joy. This introduces God as the one who makes the wicked flee, but who makes the righteous shout for joy. Verse 5, sing to God, sing praise to his name. Bank up a way for the one who rides through the desert. His name is Yah, and celebrate before him. This is the song the righteous sing, which introduces the purpose of this psalm, to begin a triumphal procession. This procession is announced here with language similar to what was used at the beginning of Babylonian processionals, where the entrance of the victor is represented by preparing a road for the victorious God to travel. The image is of banking up or building up a smooth road on which the victor could travel. See our exegetical issues video on why the Hebrew word translated desert is to be preferred over clouds, a similar sounding word from Ugaritic. The one who rides does not mean anybody who rides, but likely refers to a war charioteer, as it does elsewhere. The image of a war charioteer portrays God as a warrior. In verse 18, we discover that the imagery also includes God as the commander of a company of chariots. This commander rides through the desert. Throughout the Old Testament, many great stories of God's deliverance start with God marching out from the desert, whether it's Seir in Edom in Judges 5, Sinai, Seir, and Mount Paran in Deuteronomy 33, or Paran in Habakkuk 3. At significant times, God comes from the desert and through the desert to save his people. The shortened form of the Lord's name, Yah, is often linked to his actions as a divine warrior. It is used in Exodus in the Song of the Sea, which celebrates his bringing Israel safely through the sea, but drowning the Egyptian army in the sea. The Song of the Sea starts with these words, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Yah is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. Psalm 68 extensively uses imagery from Egypt and the Exodus, attributing the images of strength and power once associated with Egypt to God. At first, the Israelites feared the Egyptian commander of chariots, but he was thrown into the sea. God was called Yah in that story, and here in Psalm 68, he is once again known as Yah, now himself the rider, the commander of chariots. Once again, he is the one who has triumphed gloriously. Verse 6, Father of orphans and judge of widows, God is in his holy dwelling place. God is depicted as a military victor, but he also cares for the needy. He is the father of orphans and judge of widows, meaning the one who provides for the helpless and who dispenses justice for those with no protection. Widows and orphans refer to those who did not have a protector, who were easy to take advantage of. The Lord would protect the helpless and judge their situations fairly, not letting others abuse them. Victory in the ancient world was not simply about defeating one's enemies. Victories re-established peace and prosperity for one's own people, giving them reason to rejoice. True victorious kings would need not only military victories, but also righteous governments, caring for the people of their kingdom. A symbol of such a king's status would have been his enthronement in his palace. Similarly, verse 6 declares that God, the true king, is in his holy dwelling place, where God hears his people's prayer, where God provides for their needs, and where he judges the nations. Verse 7, God is the one who settles the desolate in a home, who skillfully releases prisoners. Rebels, however, dwell in an exposed land. This verse intertwines several themes from the Exodus and eventual settlement in the Promised Land. The desolate reflects the homeless Israelites wandering through the wilderness until God settled them in homes they didn't even have to build. Releasing prisoners signifies God's delivering the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The word skillfully recalls the skillful plagues God used to deliver his people, carefully attacking the beliefs of Egypt to bring humiliation and defeat by the great acts of the Lord. Egypt did not merely suffer a one-time defeat. The Lord decisively showed his superiority to their gods in every way, skillfully. After the Israelites escaped, the Egyptian army were called rebels, as in Psalm 66. After their land had been desolated by the plagues, which destroyed the crops, the land would be exposed to the heat of the sun with no protection for vegetation. This kind of reversal is characteristic of God. Those without a home are given a home in a skillful manner that destroys the strength of the former master. Instead, those proven rebels are left to live without protection, exposed to the merciless sun. Verse 8, God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, Selah. Everything implicit in the previous verses is now made explicit here. A direct address to God, who went out before his people, leading them into battle. It is God who marched through the wilderness, meaning overcoming every obstacle to come to his people's aid. The final Selah may indicate that this verse is a transition from the initial introduction of who God is to recalling specific events in Israel's history. Verse 8 begins a miniature story, starting with God going out to fight a battle at the head of the Israelite army. Verse 9, the earth quaked, and the heavens also poured before God, the one of Sinai, before God, the God of Israel. When God fought a battle, he had far more than a human army at his disposal. The very earth engaged, with the elements themselves entering into battle on his behalf. The earth quaking is an image of creation, recognizing the power and glory of its creator. The heavens pouring down reflects the understanding of God from a Canaanite perspective. While the Nile was the source of life-giving water in Egypt, rain was the source of life-giving water in Canaan. Much of Canaanite religion was based on whether or not the land produced a good harvest, and the gift of rain was seen as the primary responsibility of the gods. When the Lord, the God of Israel, went forth, the heavens poured. He was fully in charge. The one of Sinai ties this together into one story. The same God who brought Israel out of Egypt is the same God who made a covenant with her at Sinai, and it's the same God who brought her into Canaan. The one of Sinai is the God of Israel. Verse 10, you would shower abundant rain, God. Behold, your inheritance, wearied. You established it. The rain was vital. Without that rain, there could be drought and famine, as often happened in the history of the land of Canaan. The odd Hebrew, which reads, your inheritance, wearied, even gives the sense of the land gasping for breath, too weary to be able to say a full sentence. When God took action, however, the wearied land would receive abundant rain, and God would thereby establish it, meaning establish lasting prosperity within it. Verse 11, your living creatures dwelt in it. You would prepare it for the afflicted with your goodness, God. God had a purpose in refreshing the land with rain. It was so that his own people, his living creatures, would be able to dwell in it and prosper. Those who were afflicted in Egypt as slaves were the future recipients of a land flowing with milk and honey. That milk and honey were made possible with abundant rain. The Hebrew word for goodness, in contexts of drought, may even refer directly to rain, which at such times was the definition of the greatest goodness possible. The next section is battle, which describes the effect of the battle on God's enemies and his preparing a land for his own people. Before his people could settle there, the land had to be cleared of its kings and prior inhabitants. Verse 12, the Lord gives a word. The messengers are a large army. The battles the Israelites fought were not their own decision. It was the Lord who spoke and told them when and where to fight. The messengers here seem to be heralds of victory, announcing the victory even before the battle has begun. Verse 13, kings of armies, these will flee, and then those will flee, and the beautiful one of the house will divide the spoil. The prophetic victory announcement begins with kings fleeing in all directions. The phrase, beautiful one of the house, is a term of endearment used by the prophetesses, those messengers who are announcing the victory, to express the Lord's great affection for his people. The imagery of the lady of the house dividing the spoil, which is treasure taken from the enemy after they lose a battle, reminds us of Jael and Sisera in Judges 4, where Sisera fled far away from the army and took shelter in the tent of Jael, a woman. It was hers to claim victory over Sisera when she killed him with a tent peg. The victory the Lord brought was not a victory in which Israel could boast. It was an overwhelming victory, but not by their own might. Verse 14. If you lie down between the borders, the dove's wings are covered with silver, and its pinions with the yellow of gold. While the kings are fleeing the land, Israel is told to simply lie down within the land, between the borders. Once again, the people are affectionately likened to a dove with wings which are adorned with gold and silver. By merely being present, Israel receives all the plunder of the people who had lived in Canaan before, receiving houses they had not built and vineyards they had not planted. It is all a gift from the Lord, a reward for obeying him. Verse 15. When Shaddai scatters kings on it, it will snow on Zalmon. One more time the kings are mentioned, scattered. But it is not because of the Israelites. It is Shaddai, which means God as Lord over the mountains, who is responsible. This resumes the theme of verses 9 and 10, with the elements of nature joining in alongside God. The snow falls on Zalmon. The location of Zalmon is uncertain. From the next verse, it would make sense that it is a mountain in Bashan, to the north, where snow is to be expected. The picture is of kings scattering for refuge, but finding that nature itself is fighting against them. Nature is entirely at God's disposal. Verse 16. Mount Bashan is the mountain of God. Mount Bashan is a many-peaked mountain. Bashan was known for its towering peaks, reaching up to 9,000 feet in elevation, and, like many lofty mountains, was considered the home of foreign gods. The song mocks Bashan here, observing its reputation as a mountain of God, here put in quotes to indicate the mockery. It was known for its many peaks, but those qualities would become useless when faced with the God of Israel. Mount Bashan may be used to refer to just one or to refer to a range of mountains, as we see in verse 17. Verse 17. Why, mountains, many-peaked ones, do you intently watch the mountain where God desired to dwell? Indeed, the Lord will dwell there forever. The mountains of Bashan jealously watch another mountain, one which they never before considered their rival. In comparison, Jerusalem, Mount Zion, was less than 2,500 feet in elevation. Nonetheless, this was the mountain God chose as his dwelling place, and he even vowed to David that he would dwell there forever. Bashan includes the lands to the east of the Jordan River, known as the Transjordan, which is how Israel first entered Canaan. It was there that Israel fought its first battles. By personifying the mountains of Bashan, the psalm mocks the gods, and as a result also mocks the peoples whom Israel conquered, in particular the people of Og, king of Bashan. Og was the king whose bed was made of iron and more than 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. He was deserving of the might of Bashan. But his might was insufficient for the people who had the Lord at their head. The mountains do not merely see Mount Zion, however. They see God active on Mount Zion. Verse 18. God's chariotry is countless, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. The one of Sinai is among them in his holiness. Just as Elisha and his servant saw the horses and chariots of fire all around Dothan in 2 Kings 6, so now the mountains of Bashan see thousands upon thousands of God's chariotry, arrayed in holiness. God is called the one of Sinai, the mountain where the covenant was first established. But he is now on the mountain where he desired to dwell, which is Mount Zion. It is the same God who gave the law and the covenant at Sinai and chose Jerusalem for an additional covenant, with David for his dwelling place forever. The poem has spoken of the exodus from Egypt, the preparation of an inheritance, the defeat of the nations of the Transjordan, and now we see that all of that climaxes in Jerusalem. God marched out of the wilderness in order to come dwell forever in Jerusalem. Victory. This is the centerpiece of the psalm, summarizing the message in the image of God as victor, ascending to his throne in Jerusalem in triumph with the spoils of war. Verse 19. You went up on high. You took captives captive. You received gifts among mankind. And you also took captive rebels, that they may dwell with Yah God. When God marched out to dwell in Jerusalem, he did so as the conquering divine warrior, which is demonstrated here when he went up on high, meaning he ascended to Jerusalem in triumphal procession. In his procession were all the captives from his many battles, including the gifts to show loyalty from the subdued peoples. The proof of a victor was his train of captives and spoils, the captives who would live with him as ongoing evidence of his victory. They would become his servants, trophies to his greatness. In this way, the spoils of war are the hallmark of the victor, and the Lord has them all. He took captives and plunder, and now he is bringing them to Jerusalem to demonstrate to everyone the greatness of his victory. The plunder becomes goods that he is able to distribute as he wishes now to his own people. Processional. The Lord's own people now respond to his triumph, crying out in blessing and acknowledging their dependence on him. Beyond what a nation could grow or produce itself, a nation's wealth was accumulated from the spoils of war. Verse 20. May the Lord be blessed! Daily he bears our burden for us. God our salvation. Selah. For the Lord to bless his people means to grant his people special favor. For the people to bless the Lord means to express their delight at this special favor. This does not put the people in a position of authority over the Lord. It puts them in a two-way relationship in which the Lord actively seeks their pleasure, and they, in turn, express it. The Lord provides for the daily burdens of his people at all levels, from the houses and vineyards awaiting them in the land, to the ongoing military battles when God provided salvation. The spoils of this recent victory simply demonstrate, once more, that their God is victorious and provides for them. Selah, at the end of a verse, may not only close a section, but also open a section, as it does here. Verse 21. God is a God of deliverance for us, and the ways of escape from death belong to God, the Lord. Verse 21 poetically echoes the Exodus. One might even translate, the exoduses from death belong to God, the Lord. Throughout the Old Testament, the Lord becomes the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. His identity was the God who delivered Israel from slavery into a covenant relationship as his own people. He delivered them from death many times over. The ability to deliver them from death continues to belong to him, as celebrated once again in this most recent victory. Verse 22, indeed, God will crush the heads of his enemies, the hairy crown of the one who walks about in his guilt. To deliver his people from death means to deliver their enemies over to death. When the Old Testament speaks of decisive defeat, from which there is no return, it does so with particularly gruesome imagery. As in Psalm 110, here in Psalm 68, God is pictured as crushing the heads, the hairy crowns of his enemies. The enemies who deserve such defeat are those who walk about in their guilt, those judged and found guilty of wickedness, and therefore deserving of judgment. Verse 23, the Lord said, I will bring you back from Bashan. I will bring you back from the depths of the sea. The crushing defeat of the enemies enables the deliverance of the people. Bashan and the depths of the sea are poetic representations of any distress into which the people need to be delivered. God does not prevent them from falling into distress, but he vows to bring them back from all such distress, restoring them. Verse 24, so that your foot may wade in blood. As for the tongues of your dogs, their portion will be from enemies. This is the same violent picture begun in verse 22. This defeat is not only decisive, but it is so extensive that the feet of the soldiers will wade in blood. Just like Jezebel, who was humiliated when dogs licked up her blood in 2 Kings 2, these enemies will have the same end. The dogs will have more than enough to go around from the devastation of the battle. This completes the picture of decisive deliverance and defeat, summarizing a decisive victory, one of which is most likely the basis of this triumphal procession. Verse 25, your processions are seen, God, the processions of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The proper response to such defeat is the victory procession, parading all the trophies of war up to the city and into the sanctuary, where the spoils of war could be placed before the Lord. The ark was the physical representation of God's presence, so the ark would have had a central role in the procession. King is a term shared by both human king and God. God is the King of kings, with the Israelite kings his vassal kings. David acknowledges God as his king in bringing the spoils to his temple. Verse 26, the singers went in front, the musicians behind, among all the young women playing drums. The procession is described, beginning with singers, musicians, and the young women who would play drums as part of the victory dance, like Miriam did in Exodus 15. This is not a minor victory, but an occasion for great celebration. In the following verse, we hear the words of their song. Verse 27, bless God in the assembly. Bless the Lord, you who are from the source of Israel. The entire assembly is addressed, asked to join in the musical celebration with their own blessing of God, the covenant Lord, the one who has been their God since the beginning. The same God who brought them out of Egypt established the covenant at Sinai, and gave the promised land, is the same God who now dwells in Jerusalem. Those addressed are said to be from Israel's source, which here refers to Jacob, the one from whom the nation of Israel would come. This nation, the manifestation of God's promise, is put on display in the next verse. Verse 28, "There is Benjamin, the young one, their ruler. There are the princes of Judah with their throng. There are the princes of Zebulun. There are the princes of Naphtali." David mentions 4 tribes, likely as representatives of the entire nation of Israel. Benjamin is the tribe that provided the first king, King Saul, though it was known as one of the least of the tribes of Israel, or the one with the least honor. After Benjamin comes his own tribe, Judah, who were more numerous. The tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali were from the northern regions, so most likely the inclusion of these 4 is intended to start with the tribes from whom kings arose and reach out to the farthermost tribes. In this way, these tribes can represent all Israel, far and wide. Celebration. The procession has now gone by, and the rest of the song reflects the celebration and other responses to this display of Israel's strength. Verse 29. "Your God has commanded your strength. Show your strength, God, you who have acted for us." Verse 29 recognizes that it is their God who commanded and enabled this strength. It is their God who is the source of their victory and might. God remains the source of strength, which means that after recognizing he is responsible for past strength, the song immediately cries out for ongoing strength, asking that God would continue to provide strength as he has done in the past. Verse 30, "Because of your temple, which is above Jerusalem, kings will bring gifts to you." Foreign kings who see God's strength understand that for their own safety, they must come to the temple in Jerusalem to bring tribute. Otherwise, they also might be considered enemies to be destroyed. The gifts are tribute, the ancient means of acknowledging another as overlord, while still retaining some leadership. Verse 31. "Rebuke the beast of the reed, the herd of bulls among the calves, the people, those who trample down others by crushing them for silver. He has scattered people that delight in battles." Often in the Psalms, there is an imperative toward the end of the psalm that does not represent a petition to God, but rather an alignment with his proclaimed will. God's will is to rebuke the wicked and bring judgment on all enemies. The song aligns with that in the request to rebuke foreign nations. The names beast of the reed and the herd of bulls among the calves symbolize great enemies. They came to have this meaning because of their association with 2 of Israel's greatest enemies, Egypt and Bashan. The specific accusation here is a delight in unjust battles, meant only for financial and probably political gain. We are reminded of Pharaoh's greed and Og's unprovoked aggression towards Israel in Numbers 21. God scattered these enemies in the past, and it is his will to do so again. The psalmist expresses his certainty with a picture of the ultimate form of subjugation. Verse 32. "Nobles will come from Egypt. Cush will hasten his hands towards God." Once rebuked, the response will be obedient submission. Nobles will come from Egypt, acknowledging the Lord as victor. Cush, a famed people group within Egypt, will hurry to bring tribute to acknowledge God. The victory is complete when it is fully recognized by the other nations. Egypt and Cush represent this recognition. Verse 33, "Sing to God, kingdoms of the earth. Sing praises to the Lord. Selah." Egypt, Cush, and all kingdoms are now invited to move beyond any form of reluctant submission to take joy in the victory of God. They are invited to praise Him. And the Selah in the middle of the sentence may point to the unexpected nature of what comes next. Verse 34, "To Him who rides on the highest heavens of old, look, He raises His voice, a mighty voice." The kingdoms of earth are called to praise Him who rides on the highest heavens. The one who rides is the commander of chariots, the one able to defeat other armies. God, as rider on the highest heavens of old, is poetically declared the supreme God of all the heavens. The nations are called to praise Him precisely for His ability to defeat all other gods, even their own. God shows His authority over the heavens when He raises His voice, which in this context means thunder. The thunder declares and provides evidence that His dominion extends even to the heavens. Verse 35, "Ascribe strength to God. His greatness is over Israel, and His strength is in the skies." There is only one valid response to such a God: to acknowledge Him for who He is. Ascribe strength to God gives Him all the credit for the victory. He does not do it for Himself, however. The greatness of His victory is bestowed upon Israel, even while His strength is enough to fill the skies, as with those thousands and thousands of chariots. Verse 36, "You, God, are awesome from your sanctuary, the God of Israel. He gives strength and might to the people. Blessed be God." The sanctuary, the temple, is central as the place God chose and from which He acts. It is where He brought His spoils, where other kings bring tribute, and where He is celebrated as the victorious warrior. He is distinctively the God of Israel, not of other nations. There is a subtle but important shift at the very end of the psalm. Until now, God has been celebrated as victor, to whom were owed all the spoils of war. He received credit for all strength and mighty deeds. His purpose in everything, however, was to provide strength and might to the people. His purpose was to provide for His people, just as He did with the rain that nourished their land. The psalm closes with a final benediction, celebrating this God who fights on behalf of His people and then provides for them from the spoils. Psalm 68 has an astonishing collection of imagery and poetic language, interweaving the stories of the Exodus, receiving the promised land, and the Transjordanian battles, all as a backdrop to the Lord as conquering King. The Lord is so mighty that the elements of nature fight on His behalf, and enemies flee before battle can even break out. The Lord provides tenderly for His people, using the very elements that previously fought enemies to water the ground, to provide for the new inhabitants. When He enters Jerusalem, represented by His ark, nations recognize who He is, and they recognize their need to submit. Those who do not submit will earn for themselves a rebuke, but all are exhorted to join in praise. The psalm began with an exhortation to sing praise to God, who went out from the wilderness to care for His people, Through his great power, he provided for his people, first in the wilderness, and then with a rich and prosperous inheritance. This he could only do because he is supreme over kings and gods, as shown in the battle section. He needed to only give the word, and the kings would flee. The entire victory was seen in the triumphal procession up to Jerusalem, with the parade of captives and the spoils of war, which together show the proof of the victory and would then become the wealth to be distributed among the people. The proper response to such victory was celebration, with the procession described step by step in honor of the king who rescued his people from the enemy and from death. The psalm closes with a celebratory proclamation that God, enthroned in his temple, truly is supreme over all kingdoms and powers. All spoils to the victor. We will now read through the psalm in its entirety. For the director, by David, a psalm, a song. God arises, his enemies scatter, and those who hate him flee from his presence. As smoke is driven away, so you drive them away. As wax melts before a fire, so the wicked perish before God. But the righteous exult joyfully before God, and they shout with a joyful sound. Sing to God, sing praise to his name. Bank up a way for the one who rides through the desert. His name is Yah, and celebrate before him. Father of orphans and judge of widows, God is in his holy dwelling place. God is the one who settles the desolate in a home, who skillfully releases prisoners. Rebels, however, dwell in an exposed land. God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, Selah, the earth quaked, and the heavens also poured before God, the one of Sinai, before God, the God of Israel. You would shower abundant rain, God. Behold your inheritance, wearied. You established it. Your living creatures dwelt in it. You would prepare it for the afflicted with your goodness, God. The Lord gives a word. The messengers are a large army. Kings of armies, these will flee, and then those will flee. And the beautiful one of the house will divide the spoil. If you lie down between the borders, the dove's wings are covered with silver, and its pinions with the yellow of gold. When Shaddai scatters kings on it, it will snow on Zalmon. Mount Bashan is the mountain of God. Mount Bashan is a many-peaked mountain. Why, mountains, many-peaked ones, do you intently watch the mountain where God desired to dwell? Indeed, the Lord will dwell there forever. God's chariotry is countless, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. The one of Sinai is among them in his holiness. You went up on high. You took captives captive. You received gifts among mankind. And you also took captive rebels, that they may dwell with Yah God. May the Lord be blessed. Daily he bears our burden for us. God our salvation. Selah. God is a God of deliverance for us, and the ways of escape from death belong to God the Lord. Indeed, God will crush the heads of his enemies, the hairy crown of the one who walks about in his guilt. The Lord said, I will bring you back from Bashan. I will bring you back from the depths of the sea, so that your foot may wade in blood. As for the tongues of your dogs, their portion will be from enemies. Your processions are seen, God. The processions of my God, my King, into the sanctuary. The singers went in front, the musicians behind, among all the young women playing drums. Bless God in the assembly. Bless the Lord, you who are from the source of Israel. There is Benjamin, the young one, their ruler. There are the princes of Judah with their throng. There are the princes of Zebulun. There are the princes of Naphtali. Your God has commanded your strength. Show your strength, God, you who have acted for us. Because of your temple, which is above Jerusalem, kings will bring gifts to you. Rebuke the beast of the reed, the herd of bulls among the calves, the people, those who trample down others by crushing them for silver. He has scattered people that delight in battles. Nobles will come from Egypt. Cush will hasten his hands towards God. Sing to God, kingdoms of the earth. Sing praises to the Lord. Selah. To him who rides on the highest heavens of old. Look, he raises his voice, a mighty voice. Ascribe strength to God. His greatness is over Israel, and his strength is in the skies. You, God, are awesome from your sanctuary. The God of Israel, he gives strength and might to the people. Blessed be God. This has been the overview video for Psalm 68. Our goal in this video is to present a single, coherent interpretation of the psalm. Our exegetical issues video discusses other scholarly views, and our poetic features video explores the distinctively poetic nature of the psalm as Hebrew poetry. Please visit us at scriptura.world to learn about our project and to learn more about the details of this specific psalm. Thank you.